Is she more beautiful than me? Is she more taller than me? Why am I always the unlucky one and she is always the lucky one? She is already getting married while I'm not even engaged. I need to put an end to all of these. I must poison her on her wedding day. I must. Chidinma whispered to herself as her best friend Ngozi prepares for her big day. The city is alive with excitement. From towering skyscrapers to busy markets, the hustle and bustle fill the air. The warm sun casts a golden hue over the streets as the preparation for Ngozi's wedding takes center stage. In the midst of it all, two childhood friends, Chidinma and Ngozi, find themselves caught in a whirlwind of emotions. Chidinma and Ngozi grew up together in the heart of the city. They spent their days running through the markets, playing by the river, and sharing secrets beneath the shade of old trees. They were inseparable, like two sides of the same coin. But now, with Ngozi's wedding on the horizon, things feel different. For as long as Chidinma could remember, Ngozi was the shining star. From their school days to their young adult lives, people always gravitated toward Ngozi. She had an effortless beauty that drew people in, a personality that made everyone feel loved and cherished, and the kind of luck that seemed to follow her everywhere. Chidinma, on the other hand, had always felt like the quieter, more reserved friend. While Ngozi received admiration for her bright smile and bubbly spirit, Chidinma was content to stay in the background, supporting her best friend from the shadows. But as Ngozi's wedding day drew nearer, Chidinma began to feel a gnawing emptiness within her. She couldn't explain it at first, why she felt this strange mix of sadness, jealousy, and resentment. After all, Ngozi was her best friend. She should be happy for her. Yet, when she saw the way the city was captivated by her friend's upcoming wedding, something inside Chidinma twisted. Everywhere she went, she heard people talking about how beautiful the bride would look, how perfect the wedding would be, and how fortunate Ngozi was to find such a wonderful man. As they walked down the busy city streets, Chidinma couldn't help but notice how everyone's eyes were drawn to Ngozi. The way she carried herself with grace and confidence made her seem untouchable. Chidinma felt invisible beside her, as if she was living in the shadows of Ngozi's spotlight. It wasn't just the people around them, it was Chidinma herself who was beginning to question her worth. Why did everyone love Ngozi so much? Was it because she was prettier? Was it because she had a way of making everyone feel special, while Chidinma struggled to connect? At night, Chidinma lay awake in her small apartment, staring at the ceiling as thoughts of jealousy clouded her mind. She loved Ngozi with all her heart, yet she could not deny the overwhelming envy that consumed her. The thought of her friend marrying the man of her dreams filled her with a strange mix of happiness for Ngozi and bitterness toward herself. What about her own life? Why was it that no one ever seemed to notice her the way they noticed Ngozi? The wedding plans had taken over their lives. Chidinma found herself spending hours helping Ngozi pick out the wedding dress, choosing flowers for the ceremony, and even organizing the guest list. She should have felt honored to be part of such an important event. But instead, every step of the planning felt like a reminder of how insignificant her own life had become in comparison. One evening, as they sat together in a cafe overlooking the city, Ngozi's voice broke through Chidinma's thoughts. "I can't believe it's finally happening," Ngozi said, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "I'm so happy, Chidinma. I don't know what I'd do without you." Chidinma forced a smile, masking the turmoil swirling inside her. "I'm happy for you too, Ngozi. You deserve all the happiness in the world." But as she said the words, she knew they weren't entirely true. Deep down, Chidinma was overwhelmed by a sense of inadequacy. It wasn't that she didn't want her friend to be happy, it was that she couldn't shake the feeling that her happiness was slipping away, replaced by a quiet, aching resentment. Chidinma's thoughts grew darker as the wedding day neared. She started to wonder if she would ever be able to break free from the shadow of Ngozi's perfect life. She loved her best friend dearly, but the weight of her jealousy was becoming unbearable. The city, with all its glitz and glamour, seemed to highlight everything she felt she was missing. Late one night, as Chidinma walked home through the dimly lit streets, a thought crossed her mind. What if, just for a moment, she could be the one in control? What if, for once, people would look at her and not just at Ngozi? What if the attention and admiration that seemed to flow to Ngozi could be hers instead? The thought, though fleeting, planted a seed in Chidinma's mind. It was a dangerous thought, but it was a thought that, in her jealousy and desperation, began to grow. Would she be willing to do whatever it took to make sure that, for once, she wasn't standing in her best friend's shadow? Setting: the city is bustling with activity, busy markets, towering buildings, and streets filled with the chatter of vendors selling wares. The elegant venue for Ngozi's wedding is located on the outskirts of the city, where grand halls and fancy restaurants provide the perfect backdrop for lavish events. The air is thick with anticipation as Ngozi's wedding plans near their climax. The day after their cafe meeting, Chidinma finds herself alone in her small apartment, staring at the invitation to Ngozi's wedding. She runs her fingers over the embossed edges, feeling the weight of the paper as if it were a heavy burden. She had promised herself that she would help make this day special for Ngozi. But that promise felt hollow now, overshadowed by the growing envy that consumed her heart. She should have been happy for her best friend, but the more she thought about it, the more resentful she became. That evening, Ngozi calls her to meet up for a final wedding meal tasting. It was a lavish affair, the kind of gathering that marked the divide between the life Chidinma had always known and the life she thought she could never have. The restaurant where they were meeting, a high-end establishment known for its exquisite cuisine, had been booked by Ngozi's family for the wedding reception. The decor was extravagant: crystal chandeliers, white roses arranged in the corners, and the smell of gourmet food wafting through the air. Chidinma entered with a smile on her face, but her heart felt cold. The contrast between the event and her feelings was unbearable. They sat at a long table with family members and friends, the soft hum of conversation and laughter filling the space. The air was thick with the sounds of the clinking of glasses, the whispering of compliments, and the soft notes of a piano playing in the background. Ngozi sat at the head of the table, glowing in her excitement, her face radiating happiness as the chefs presented the dishes to the group for tasting. Chidinma watched quietly, a fake smile pasted on her face, but the envy bubbling inside her was undeniable. "Everything looks so beautiful, doesn't it?" Ngozi asked, turning to Chidinma with a bright smile. "It's perfect," Chidinma replied, forcing the words out of her mouth. She didn't want to ruin the moment for her best friend, but she could hardly stomach the perfection of it all. As the food arrived, Chidinma's gaze followed the serving plates. There were rich delicacies, succulent meats, vibrant vegetables, and glistening, delicate desserts. Chidinma could barely look at it without thinking of how out of place she felt. She felt like an outsider in a world where she had once belonged. And yet, here she was, watching Ngozi bask in the glory of a life that seemed to come so easily to her, while Chidinma had struggled for everything she had. The waiter presented a special dish, a main course, that was meant to be the highlight of the wedding feast. The chef had taken great care in preparing it, and Ngozi beamed at the thought of how special it would be to her guests. As the platter was placed in front of her, Chidinma couldn't help but feel the rage bubbling inside her. Her friend was about to marry the man of her dreams, and she was about to become the center of attention, with all eyes on her. Chidinma's eyes lingered on the food, but they moved quickly to the corner of the restaurant, where the chef was standing. His back was turned, busy organizing the next course. In that moment, something inside Chidinma snapped. What if, just once, she could be the one to get noticed? What if she could be the one to have all the eyes on her for once, rather than Ngozi? The thought seemed absurd at first. But the longer she watched Ngozi smile, the more the thought took root. Her jealousy, once quiet and contained, now screamed at her to act. Suddenly, she knew what she had to do. With a few careful movements, Chidinma slipped away from the table. She excused herself under the pretense of needing a moment alone. Her heart pounded in her chest as she moved toward the back of the restaurant. There, in the kitchen, the chef was busy plating the food. Chidinma knew that the dish set aside for Ngozi had already been prepared, and all she needed was the opportunity to slip something into it. She found the poison quickly. It was a small vial of powder, tucked away in a dark corner of the kitchen where the chef kept various ingredients. Chidinma had heard rumors about poisons being used in the city for various reasons, but she never thought she would be in a position to use it. She hesitated for only a moment before uncorking the vial and pouring it into the dish meant for Ngozi. It was a calculated move, one done with a clear but twisted intention. She stirred the contents of the dish, making sure it was well mixed. The wedding had to be ruined. Ngozi's moment in the spotlight had to end. With the poison now in the dish, Chidinma returned to her seat at the table, her heart racing with guilt and excitement. She sat back down, offering a smile to Ngozi, who was happily chatting with the other guests. But deep inside, Chidinma was trembling. Was she doing the right thing? Could she really go through with it? The fear gnawed at her, but it was quickly replaced by the need for control, the craving to see Ngozi's happiness disrupted, even for a moment. The moment was coming closer. Ngozi took a bite of the poison dish, savoring the flavor, unaware of the danger it posed. Chidinma watched intently, her heart pounding as the food disappeared into Ngozi's mouth. The action had been done. There was no turning back. Setting, the grand city hall stands in all its glory, adorned with vibrant flowers, white curtains draping the walls, and golden chandeliers hanging above. The air is electric with excitement. Guests bustle in their finest clothes, greeting each other with smiles and laughter. The stage is set for Ngozi's wedding, and the whole city is abuzz with anticipation. The day of the wedding arrives, and the city is alive with a level of energy only a grand celebration like this could bring. Cars honk as they pull into the venue, their passengers dressed in their most beautiful clothes. The streets are a parade of joyous people, singing and dancing as they make their way to the venue. The wedding day is a city event. Ngozi is not just the bride of the hour, she is the star of the city. Everyone has gathered to see her wed, and the sense of joy fills the air. Chidinma stands on the steps of the city hall, watching as the guests file in, their eyes shining with admiration for Ngozi. As she looks around, she can feel the weight of her own emotions threatening to overwhelm her. She should be happy, she tells herself, but the jealousy deep and overwhelming burns hotter than ever. This was supposed to be a celebration of love, yet all she could focus on was how perfect everything was for Ngozi. The dress, the cake, the flowers, the people, everything was a reminder of how she was always left in the shadows, watching as her best friend stole the spotlight. As the ceremony begins, Chidinma is right beside Ngozi, dressed in a beautiful blue gown as the maid of honor. She holds the bouquet of white roses in her hand, but the weight of it feels heavier than it ever should. Her hands tremble slightly as she stands by Ngozi's side, a warm smile on her face, though inside, her stomach churns with dread. She knows what she did, and the guilt of it claws at her. Ngozi, radiant in her white wedding gown, stands at the altar, her eyes sparkling as she gazes at her groom. She looks more beautiful than ever, a perfect picture of happiness. The guests ooh and ah as the vows are exchanged. Chidinma watches, unable to tear her eyes away from her friend's face. The smile on Ngozi's lips is genuine, her voice full of joy as she promises to love her new husband for the rest of her life. Chidinma feels an ache deep in her chest as she watches. This was supposed to be her friend's happiest day, but all she can focus on is how the attention and admiration have been stolen from her. The jealous thoughts swirl, but she pushes them down. She forces herself to smile as she watches Ngozi, trying to mask the betrayal she feels inside. The ceremony continues smoothly, with guests whispering their admiration and approval. Ngozi's family is overjoyed, clapping and cheering as the couple is announced as husband and wife. The music swells, and Chidinma claps along with everyone else, though her heart is heavy. She is no longer sure if she can keep up the facade much longer. All around her, the guests are absorbed in the joy of the day, but Chidinma feels distant, detached from it all. Finally, it's time for the reception to begin, and the guests are ushered to their tables, ready for the feast. The hall is a sight to behold, white linens draped across long tables, golden plates filled with exquisite dishes, and candles flickering in the low light. The smell of the food fills the room, making Chidinma's stomach turn. She can hear the laughter of the guests and the clinking of glasses, but all she can think about is the one dish she knows will soon reach Ngozi's table. Chidinma glances at the head table, where Ngozi and her new husband are seated. They're beaming, holding hands, their eyes locked in a gaze of pure love and happiness. The waiters begin to serve the food, and Chidinma feels the tightness in her chest grow stronger. She watches as the poison dish is placed in front of Ngozi. Her heart races. This is the moment. She's made it this far, and there's no turning back now. She knows that the poison she added will soon begin to take effect. Ngozi takes her first bite, smiling as she does. The room goes quiet for a moment, everyone waiting to see her reaction. "Delicious," she says, nodding in appreciation to the chef. The guests continue to eat, chatting and laughing, oblivious to the storm about to hit. Chidinma's stomach twists as she watches her friend eat, her mind spinning with guilt, but also with an unexpected sense of satisfaction. This is what she wanted, wasn't it? To be the one who stood out? To be the one who no longer felt invisible? But as Ngozi takes another bite, something changes. The smile on Ngozi's face begins to falter. Her hand reaches for her chest as her breath becomes shallow. The color drains from her face, and she suddenly looks pale, like the life is being drained out of her. Chidinma watches in horror as Ngozi gasps, her eyes wide with confusion and panic. What's happening? Chidinma thinks, her heart racing. She stands up quickly, her hands trembling, but it's too late. Ngozi suddenly collapses, falling forward onto the table. A scream erupts from the guests as chaos fills the room. People rush to Ngozi's side, but she is unresponsive, her body trembling, her breath shallow. Chidinma stands frozen in place, her mind in a daze. Panic sets in as she watches her best friend fight for her life. The reality of what she has done begins to sink in. She was the one who poisoned the food. She had been the one to betray her friend, and now, it was too late to undo it. The room erupts into chaos as the guests shout for help, and people rush to call for an ambulance. Chidinma stands motionless, caught between the guilt gnawing at her insides, and the fear of being discovered. Her world is crumbling before her eyes, and for the first time, the jealousy that had fueled her actions feels like a distant memory, replaced by a cold, hard truth. She had just ruined everything. As the paramedics rush into the hall, the scene unfolds into a whirlwind of confusion. Ngozi's life is now in the hands of strangers, and Chidinma's heart pounds in her chest, the weight of her actions pressing down on her. She didn't want this. She never imagined that the consequences of her jealousy would be so dire. But now, with the future uncertain, she must face the reality of what she's done. A pristine city hospital, where cold white walls, antiseptic smells, and the soft hum of medical equipment create an atmosphere of tension and unease. The waiting area is crowded with worried family members and friends, pacing back and forth, their faces etched with fear and confusion. Outside the hospital windows, the city continues on with its busy, oblivious routine. The wedding celebration has turned into a nightmare. The grand hall that once echoed with laughter and joy is now abandoned, empty of its once celebratory energy. All that remains is the bitter silence that hangs over the entire event. Ngozi, the bride of the hour, is fighting for her life in the hospital, and Chidinma is trapped in the unrelenting grip of guilt. Chidinma hasn't left the hospital since they rushed Ngozi inside. She had followed in the wake of the ambulance, her heart pounding in her chest. The terror in her stomach had never been more real. As the paramedics worked on Ngozi in the emergency room, Chidinma was left in a haze of confusion and regret, unable to process what she had done. It was supposed to be a harmless act, just a way to feel noticed, but now, the horror of it was taking over. She hadn't imagined this, the chaos, the fear, the screams. This wasn't what she wanted. She didn't want to hurt her best friend. But the cold truth was undeniable. Chidinma had poisoned Ngozi, and now Ngozi was fighting for her life. It was happening, and there was no way to stop it. Chidinma wanders through the sterile hallways of the hospital, her feet dragging as she moves past the bustling nurses and doctors. Her mind is clouded with guilt, and the weight of her actions feels unbearable. She knows she should be by Ngozi's side, but she can't bring herself to face her best friend. How could she? How could she face the woman she had betrayed so completely? She pauses by the door of the waiting room, where Ngozi's family and friends are gathered. They stand in tense silence, the air thick with uncertainty. Chidinma spots Ngozi's mother, her face pale and filled with worry. The woman who had once treated Chidinma like a second daughter now looks at her with eyes full of doubt. Chidinma knows she can't stay there, not when every moment of her presence feels like a betrayal. So she steps away and walks down the long, empty corridor, her eyes unfocused as she tries to block out the sounds of distant conversations and footsteps. In the emergency room, Ngozi's condition worsens. Doctors and nurses scramble to save her life, but every passing second feels like an eternity. Chidinma sits in a secluded corner of the hospital, the weight of her guilt so heavy that she can barely breathe. The silence is suffocating. She tries to remember the joy she saw in Ngozi's face when they were together earlier that morning, but all she can see now is the image of Ngozi collapsing in the wedding hall, her body trembling and lifeless. It's a memory that will haunt her forever. Minutes feel like hours, and hours like days. The tension in the hospital is palpable. Chidinma's hands shake as she clutches her phone, staring at the screen but not seeing anything. The buzzing of notifications in her hand seems distant. Her thoughts are consumed with the image of Ngozi, so strong and full of life one moment, now fighting for her survival in a sterile hospital room. Finally, after what seems like an eternity, the doctor emerges from the ER. His face is grim. Chidinma's heart skips a beat. The doctor looks around the waiting area, spotting Ngozi's family, before he turns his attention toward Chidinma. She rises, her legs weak beneath her. Is she? Chidinma's voice cracks as she struggles to speak, her throat dry from the fear and shame that have taken over her. The doctor's expression softens, but there's no comforting news in his eyes. She's stable for now, he says. But the poison has caused significant damage. It's too early to say how much recovery is possible. We'll need to monitor her closely. Chidinma's heart sinks. What kind of damage? Her voice is barely above a whisper, a mixture of dread and disbelief in her words. Her mind races, unable to process the doctor's cold response. The doctor hesitates for a moment, and then adds, the effects of the poison could be irreversible. We just don't know yet. Chidinma's knees buckle beneath her, and she stumbles back into the hallway, her hands gripping the wall to steady herself. Her worst fear has come true. Ngozi's life, the one thing that had seemed so certain, was now hanging in the balance. And it was her fault. She had done this. She had taken away the life of the woman she called her best friend. And for what? For a fleeting moment of attention, for a shallow desire to be seen and recognized. As Chidinma retreats into a corner of the hospital, her tears flow freely. She can't stop them. The guilt, the regret, the realization of her betrayal, it all hits her like a wave crashing over her. She doesn't know how long she's been sitting there, her hands pressed to her face, but when she finally looks up, she realizes that Ngozi's family has gathered near the entrance to the waiting room. They are all looking toward her, their eyes filled with suspicion and concern. She knows what they're thinking. They know something is wrong. And they're right. In that moment, Chidinma feels the full weight of the truth. The consequences of her actions are only beginning to unfold. The betrayal she had committed is about to be exposed. And no amount of regret can undo the damage she's caused. The unraveling has begun, and there is no turning back. The once vibrant wedding venue now stands in eerie silence, reflecting the change from a day of celebration to one of sorrow. The hospital room, sterile and cold, is where Ngozi remains unconscious, her life still hanging by a thread. Outside, the city continues its busy routine, unaware of the tragedy that has unfolded behind the hospital doors. The weight of Chidinma's actions is inescapable. The waiting area of the hospital is filled with quiet, anxious whispers. Family members, friends, and acquaintances of Ngozi have gathered, their eyes scanning the hall for any signs of news. Chidinma sits at the far corner of the room, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. The walls seem to close in on her as the guilt of what she has done continues to weigh heavily on her heart. Her once carefree thoughts are now consumed by the terrible reality of her betrayal. The minutes seem to drag into hours as Chidinma waits. Her mind replays the events of the day, the wedding, the poison, Ngozi's collapse. Each memory stabs at her, and the pain is unbearable. She stares at the floor, too ashamed to meet anyone's eyes. Chidinma had thought she was making a choice to be noticed, to escape the suffocating feelings of being invisible, but now she realizes the enormity of her mistake. The jealousy that drove her to poison her best friend has left her trapped in a prison of her own making. A door opens, and the doctor enters the waiting room. Chidinma's heart skips a beat. The room grows still as everyone's eyes turn toward him. The air is thick with anticipation, and for the first time, Chidinma dares to look up. The doctor's face is weary, his eyes somber. He approaches Ngozi's family, and Chidinma watches from her seat, her breath shallow. Ngozi's condition is stable for now, the doctor says, his voice measured. We've managed to stabilize her, but there's still a long road ahead. The poison caused severe damage to her internal organs. We'll need to continue monitoring her closely. Relief washes over the room, but it's bittersweet. No one dares to smile, and the heavy silence speaks volumes. Chidinma, however, feels a tightening in her chest. The moment she had hoped for, the possibility that Ngozi might recover, feels like a hollow victory. The damage has been done. It doesn't matter if Ngozi survives, Chidinma's actions have already changed everything. As the doctor leaves, Chidinma sits still, her mind racing. She wants to go to Ngozi's side, to apologize, to beg for forgiveness. But she knows that it's too late for words. How could she ask for forgiveness when she's the one who nearly took everything from Ngozi? How could she ever repair the bond they once shared? The waiting room begins to clear as some family members head to the cafeteria to take a break. But Chidinma remains, feeling more isolated than ever. She is alone with her thoughts, each one a harsh reminder of the betrayal she has caused. For a long time, she sits in silence, unable to move or speak. The weight of her guilt is suffocating. Suddenly, the door opens again, and this time, it's Ngozi's mother who enters. She has tears in her eyes, and her face is filled with both exhaustion and deep concern. She looks at Chidinma for a long moment before speaking, her voice trembling. "Chidinma," she says softly. "I need to speak with you." Chidinma's stomach lurches. She stands slowly, unable to look the older woman in the eye. Her heart pounds in her chest, and she feels a cold sweat break out across her forehead. The guilt that has been building up inside her is now a tangible thing, suffocating her with every word. "I don't know what happened," Ngozi's mother continues, her voice shaky. "But I know something's not right. What happened at the wedding? What did you do?" Chidinma's knees feel weak. She opens her mouth to speak, but no words come out. The truth sits heavy in her throat. She had poisoned Ngozi, her best friend, the woman who had been like a sister to her, and now there was no hiding from it. The silence stretches between them, and Chidinma feels the full weight of her betrayal. Finally, she speaks, her voice barely above a whisper. I poisoned her," she says, her voice breaking. "I thought if I could just get noticed, if I could just have something for myself, it would be enough. But I didn't mean for it to go this far. I didn't mean for her to suffer. I never wanted this." Tears begin to well in Chidinma's eyes as she admits the truth. The words seem to crush her, each syllable a new weight on her conscience. She looks up at Ngozi's mother, who stands before her, stunned. There is silence between them for a long time, and in that silence, Chidinma feels her heart breaking. How could she have done this to someone she loved so much? Ngozi's mother doesn't speak for a moment, her face hardening. Then, slowly, she shakes her head. "I trusted you, Chidinma," she says, her voice shaking with emotion. "I trusted you to look after her, to be there for her. And you betrayed her. You betrayed all of us." The words strike Chidinma like a slap in the face. She knows they're true. She can't deny it. She has betrayed the one person who had always been there for her. No apology can erase what she's done. I'm sorry, Chidinma whispers, tears streaming down her face. I am so sorry. Ngozi's mother sighs, her eyes filled with disappointment and sorrow. Sorry won't undo what you've done. You've hurt her in a way that can never be undone. As she turns to leave, Chidinma's heart breaks. She knows that no amount of sorrow or regret will ever change what happened. The bond between her and Ngozi has been shattered, perhaps beyond repair. With her heart heavy, Chidinma walks to Ngozi's room. She stands at the door for a long moment, staring at the woman she had once called her best friend. The woman she had betrayed. The woman she had nearly killed. Inside, Ngozi lies unconscious, her pale face reflecting the pain and damage that Chidinma had caused. Chidinma can't bring herself to enter the room. Instead, she stands outside, staring at the woman she betrayed. There's no turning back now. No matter what happens, the consequences of jealousy will follow her forever. As Chidinma walks away from the door, she feels the finality of her actions. No amount of regret can bring back the love and trust that has been lost. The price of jealousy, the cost of betrayal, is steep. And now, she must live with that price for the rest of her life.